Right now, if you ask most people how long ancient humans typically lived, you'll probably hear something like 25 or 30, a number repeated so often it's practically become common knowledge. But this widely repeated figure is actually deeply misleading, mixing up two truly different statistical concepts in a way that paints a considerably more grim picture of ancient human lifespan than the actual evidence really supports. So, how long could a human actually live throughout history? And why does the popular version of this statistic get things so consistently wrong? Let's dig into this properly because untangling this particular statistical confusion reveals something considerably more interesting and considerably more nuanced than the commonly repeated headline number. Let's start with the core statistical confusion itself, because this represents the single most important thing to understand before anything else in this entire topic makes proper sense. When historians and demographers cite an average life expectancy of 25 or 30 years for many ancient and historical populations, they're describing average life expectancy at birth, a statistic that gets dramatically, disproportionately pulled downward by extremely high infant and child mortality rates. A topic already explored at considerable length in other discussions regarding how early humans worked to protect their most vulnerable children. This is a seriously crucial distinction worth sitting with directly, because average life expectancy at birth doesn't actually tell you how long a typical adult who survived childhood could expect to live. It tells you the average across the entire population, including all the individuals who tragically died as infants or young children, whose extremely short lifespans dramatically drag that overall average number down. Let's talk through a simplified example to make this statistical distinction remarkably concrete and clear, because abstract statistical explanation alone can be difficult to properly internalize. Imagine a hypothetical ancient population where half of all children died before reaching age 5, while everyone who survived past that point went on to live to around 60 years old. The average life expectancy at birth for this entire population would come out to somewhere around 30 years old, a fairly grim sounding number. But this average obscures the fact that anyone who actually survived childhood in this hypothetical population had a very real, very reasonable chance of living a full, complete adult life stretching well into their 60s. The statistic isn't describing typical adult lifespan at all. It's describing an average that's been dramatically skewed downward by tragically high childhood mortality specifically. This detail fundamentally reframes the entire question worth asking. Rather than how long did ancient humans typically live, the more accurate, more revealing question is how long could an ancient human expect to live if they successfully survived the actually dangerous, high risk period of infancy and early childhood? And the answer to that specific, more precise question turns out to be considerably more optimistic than the commonly repeated 25 to 30 years figure would ever suggest on its own. Let's talk about what the actual archaeological and historical evidence reveals about adult lifespan specifically, once childhood mortality gets properly separated out from the broader statistical picture. Skeletal analysis from numerous ancient sites, combined with historical demographic records from societies with sufficiently detailed record keeping, consistently shows that adults who survived childhood in a wide range of ancient and historical populations frequently lived into their 50s, 60s, and in a meaningful number of documented cases, considerably beyond that, well into what we today recognize as genuine old age. This detail directly contradicts the common, casual assumption that ancient humans were somehow biologically incapable of living much beyond 30 years old under any circumstances, an assumption the misleading, oversimplified average life expectancy statistic has unfortunately helped reinforce and perpetuate in popular understanding. Let's talk about specific historical and anthropological evidence supporting this more accurate picture, because grounding this discussion in concrete examples helps move beyond abstract statistical explanation alone. Ancient Roman funerary inscriptions, which frequently recorded the age of the deceased individual, show a meaningful number of adults living well into their 60s, 70s, and occasionally even beyond, once you specifically examine the inscriptions belonging to individuals who had clearly already survived childhood and early adulthood. Similarly, anthropological studies of various traditional hunter-gatherer societies offering valuable comparative insight into the kind of lifestyle and environmental conditions early humans likely experienced, consistently find that adults who survive the really dangerous early childhood period frequently live into their 60s and 70s, broadly comparable to, though generally still somewhat lower than, average adult lifespan in modern developed societies with access to contemporary medical care. Let's talk about why childhood mortality specifically was so dramatically, disproportionately high throughout most of human history, because understanding this helps explain exactly why it so thoroughly distorts the overall average life expectancy statistic in the specific way it consistently does. Without modern medicine, vaccines, or any real understanding of germ theory, infectious disease posed an enormous, constant threat to infants and young children specifically, whose immune systems hadn't yet had the chance to develop meaningful resistance to the wide range of pathogens circulating within their environment. Complications during childbirth itself, discussed at greater length in other explorations of how ancient societies actually handled pregnancy and childbirth specifically, also claimed a significant number of infant lives before, during, and shortly after the birth process itself. This meant a disproportionate percentage of total deaths within any given ancient population were concentrated specifically within the first few years of life, which mathematically has an enormous, outsized effect on any calculated average that includes these figures, dragging the overall population average dramatically downward, even when adults who successfully survived past this specific dangerous window frequently went on to live considerably longer, healthier lives than the misleading headline statistic would ever suggest on its own. Let's talk about how this statistical confusion actually originated and became so widely, persistently misunderstood in popular culture too, because this represents an interesting question worth addressing directly in its own right. Average life expectancy at birth is a truly useful, legitimate statistic for certain specific purposes, comparing overall public health outcomes between different populations or historical periods, for instance, since it does capture the very real, very significant impact of childhood mortality on a population's overall health and well-being. The problem isn't that this statistic itself is inherently flawed or useless. The problem is that this specific statistic frequently gets casually, carelessly interpreted and popularly repeated as though it directly represented typical adult lifespan specifically. A considerably different and more specific question that this particular statistic was never actually designed to directly answer in the first place. Let's talk about specific hunter-gatherer population studies in more detail, because this represents some of the most directly relevant comparative evidence available for understanding likely prehistoric human lifespan patterns. Detailed demographic studies of populations like the Hadza in Tanzania and various other contemporary or recently studied hunter-gatherer groups have found that once individuals survive past the significant early childhood mortality risk period, remaining life expectancy jumps dramatically, with a meaningful percentage of adults who reach their 20s going on to live into their 60s and 70s. These specific studies are particularly valuable because they involve directly observed, carefully documented populations living under conditions reasonably comparable to the kind of environment and lifestyle early prehistoric humans likely experienced, offering considerably more direct, reliable evidence compared to purely inferential estimates drawn from skeletal remains alone. Let's talk about the grandmother hypothesis specifically too, because it connects directly and meaningfully to this broader topic of adult human lifespan, offering an interesting evolutionary angle worth exploring in more depth. Researchers studying human evolutionary biology have proposed that humans evolved a notably extended post-reproductive lifespan, particularly pronounced in women following menopause. Specifically because older, post-reproductive individuals provided significant, measurable value to their extended family and broader community through accumulated practical knowledge, childcare assistance, and general social support. This evolutionary theory only makes logical sense if a meaningful percentage of ancient humans regularly survived well into their 50s, 60s, and beyond, since evolution wouldn't have favored developing and maintaining an extended post-reproductive lifespan if humans rarely or never actually lived long enough to meaningfully benefit from it in practice. The very existence of this evolved pattern, itself well documented and extensively studied by researchers focused on human evolutionary biology specifically, provides strong, independent scientific support for the broader argument already established throughout this topic. Substantial adult longevity, well beyond simple reproductive age, represents a genuine, long standing feature of human biology and social structure, rather than some kind of exclusively modern development made possible only by recent medical advancement. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about specific documented cases of exceptional ancient longevity too, because these individual examples help make the broader statistical argument considerably more concrete and personally relatable. Various ancient texts and inscriptions reference specific individuals reportedly living into notably advanced old age. And while some of these specific historical claims should be treated with appropriate scholarly caution, given the practical challenges of verifying exact ages in ancient records, the sheer frequency and consistency with which such claims appear across completely independent ancient cultures and historical periods suggests that advanced old age, however defined within each specific cultural context, was a recognized, culturally significant, and clearly achievable life stage within many ancient societies, rather than representing some kind of impossible biological fantasy entirely disconnected from lived ancient reality. Let's talk about how this misunderstanding regarding ancient lifespan connects to broader misconceptions about historical human capability more generally too, because this represents an interesting, worthwhile pattern to recognize and address directly. The mistaken belief that ancient humans rarely lived past 30 frequently gets casually combined with other related misconceptions, the assumption that ancient societies had few, if any, elderly members, or that concepts like grandparenthood and multi-generational family structures are somehow primarily modern developments. The actual archaeological and anthropological evidence directly contradicts these related assumptions as well, showing that multi-generational family structures, with grandparents and even occasionally great-grandparents actively present and involved within extended family units, were a well-documented, consistent feature of many ancient and traditional societies throughout history, connecting directly back to the grandmother hypothesis and broader evolutionary evidence already discussed specifically regarding the genuine, practical value older community members consistently provided within these ancient social structures. Let's talk about how modern popular media and casual conversation continue perpetuating this specific misconception too, because understanding exactly why this particular statistical error remains so persistently widespread despite being fairly well understood and corrected within academic and historical research circles is worth addressing directly. The ancient humans died at 30 claim functions as a simple, memorable, dramatic-sounding statistic that fits neatly into a compelling narrative about modern medical and scientific progress, making it a particularly attractive, frequently repeated talking point in popular science communication, documentaries, and casual conversation, even though the underlying statistical nuance explaining what this figure actually represents rarely gets properly explained or accurately conveyed alongside the headline number itself. This pattern, a technically accurate but frequently misapplied and poorly contextualized statistic becoming widely popularized in an oversimplified, ultimately misleading form, represents a recurring challenge throughout popular science communication more broadly, well beyond just this specific topic regarding ancient human lifespan. Let's talk about how maximum human lifespan, as opposed to typical or average lifespan, has likely changed, or more accurately, likely hasn't changed nearly as dramatically as most people probably assume, because this represents an important, related distinction worth exploring specifically. While average and typical adult lifespan has certainly increased considerably in the modern era, driven by improvements in medicine, sanitation, and nutrition, the actual maximum potential human lifespan, the absolute upper limit of how long a human body can biologically continue functioning under the most favorable possible circumstances, appears to have remained considerably more stable across human history than most people probably assume. Historical and even some ancient records reference individuals reportedly living into their 80s, 90s, and occasionally beyond, suggesting the basic biological upper limit for human lifespan likely hasn't shifted nearly as dramatically as the average lifespan statistics might otherwise suggest, even while acknowledging that verifying the precise accuracy of some of these specific ancient longevity claims presents its own real historical and methodological challenges worth taking seriously. Let's talk about how researchers actually distinguish and calculate these different lifespan statistics from ancient skeletal remains, too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers examining ancient skeletal remains use various physical indicators, including specific patterns of bone density change, joint wear, and dental wear, to estimate an individual's approximate age at death, allowing researchers to construct a detailed age at death profile for an entire excavated ancient population. By separating out individuals who died during infancy and early childhood from those who survived into adulthood, researchers can calculate a considerably more accurate, more seriously informative picture of typical adult lifespan specifically, rather than relying purely on a single, blended average statistic that obscures this crucial underlying distinction entirely. Let's talk about ancient philosophical and literary treatment of old age too, because this offers another valuable, complementary source of evidence worth exploring specifically, beyond the purely archaeological and statistical evidence already discussed at length. Numerous ancient Greek and Roman philosophical texts specifically address the experience and challenges of advanced old age as a familiar, well understood life stage, with several prominent ancient philosophers writing extensively and specifically about the particular wisdom, challenges, and social role associated with reaching truly advanced age within their own society. The very existence of this substantial body of ancient philosophical writing specifically dedicated to advanced old age strongly suggests this life stage was common and familiar enough within ancient society to warrant serious, sustained philosophical attention and discussion, rather than representing some kind of vanishingly rare biological exception, barely worth any serious philosophical or literary consideration at all. Let's talk about ancient legal and social systems too, because they offer yet another useful, complementary angle on this broader topic worth exploring specifically. Many ancient legal codes and social systems included specific provisions and considerations relevant to elderly individuals, inheritance law, provisions for elder care within extended families, and specific social and legal status distinctions tied to advanced age, all of which would have made little practical sense to develop and maintain if reaching seriously advanced age had been an extraordinarily rare, marginal occurrence within that particular ancient society. The presence of these detailed legal and social frameworks specifically addressing old age provides additional, independent evidence reinforcing the broader statistical and archaeological picture already established throughout this topic. Let's talk briefly about how this whole topic connects to modern misunderstandings about historical quality of life more broadly, too, because it's worth drawing out one final important connecting thread before wrapping up completely. The persistent ancient humans died at 30. Misconception doesn't just distort understanding of lifespan specifically. It frequently gets bundled together with a broader, similarly oversimplified assumption that ancient life was uniformly brutal, short, and devoid of anything resembling the accumulated wisdom, family continuity, and multi-generational social structure most people today associate specifically with modern life. The actual evidence, spanning archaeology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, and surviving ancient literary and legal records, consistently paints a considerably more nuanced picture, one where ancient life certainly involved real, serious hardship and genuine risk, particularly during infancy and early childhood, but where surviving adults frequently experienced long, full lives complete with many of the same later life milestones, extended family relationships, and accumulated wisdom that modern people tend to assume were exclusively available to considerably more recent generations. Let's talk about variation across different ancient and historical populations too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly that adult lifespan certainly wasn't uniform or identical across every single ancient society and historical period, without exception. Populations facing particularly severe environmental hardship, chronic warfare, or repeated famine conditions likely experienced somewhat reduced adult lifespan compared to populations enjoying more stable, favorable environmental and social circumstances, echoing a similar pattern of meaningful historical variation already discussed extensively regarding numerous other topics throughout this broader exploration of ancient human life. This variation is worth acknowledging honestly, rather than presenting an overly simplistic, uniform picture suggesting every single ancient population experienced identical adult lifespan and identical life circumstances, since the actual historical and archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates meaningful variation depending on the specific society, environment, and historical period actually being examined. It's worth acknowledging one final methodological limitation honestly before wrapping up, because presenting this topic with full intellectual honesty matters more than presenting an overly tidy, uncomplicated conclusion. Estimating precise age at death from skeletal remains alone becomes progressively less accurate the older an individual actually was at the time of death, since the specific physical markers researchers rely on, joint wear, bone density change, tend to plateau and become less reliably distinguishable once an individual reaches sufficiently advanced age. This means researchers can generally identify with reasonable confidence that a given ancient skeleton belonged to someone who died in older adulthood, broadly speaking, but pinning down an exact age within older adulthood specifically, distinguishing precisely between someone who died at 62 versus 78, for instance, becomes considerably less reliable using skeletal evidence alone. This limitation doesn't undermine the broader argument already established throughout this topic, but it's worth acknowledging honestly as a genuine methodological constraint researchers actively work within, rather than presenting ancient age estimation as a perfectly precise, uncomplicated science free of any meaningful uncertainty or margin of error. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, more accurate answer to how long humans could actually live throughout history turns out to be considerably more optimistic and considerably more nuanced than the commonly repeated, misleading 25 to 30 year statistic could ever properly capture on its own. That widely cited figure reflects average life expectancy at birth, a statistic dramatically, disproportionately skewed downward by tragically high infant and childhood mortality rates, rather than accurately reflecting typical adult lifespan specifically. Once you properly separate out childhood mortality from the broader statistical picture, the evidence consistently reveals that adults who successfully survived childhood throughout most of human history frequently lived well into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes considerably beyond, broadly comparable to, though generally still somewhat below, typical adult lifespan in modern societies, with full access to contemporary medical care and public health infrastructure. So the next time someone confidently states that ancient humans simply didn't live past 30, it's worth remembering that this popular, frequently repeated claim reflects a genuine, persistent statistical misunderstanding rather than an accurate historical reality. Ancient humans who survived the remarkably dangerous, high-risk early years of childhood had a very real, very reasonable chance of living a full, complete adult life, stretching across several additional decades, experiencing many of the same later life stages, grandparenthood, elder status within their community, and advanced age more broadly, that people today generally associate exclusively with considerably more modern circumstances and medical advancement, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as widely repeated and confidently stated as ancient humans only lived to 30 turns out to be this significant a statistical misunderstanding, built on a genuine but frequently misapplied demographic statistic, what other commonly repeated, seemingly authoritative facts about the deep human past might be resting on a similarly subtle, similarly overlooked statistical or conceptual confusion, quietly distorting popular understanding of history in ways most people never think to carefully examine or question.